Good day, everyone. This lesson is about respiratory pharmacology. We'll be dealing with respiratory agents, and this lesson is divided into two parts: the upper respiratory tract and your lower respiratory tract. Learning outcomes. After studying this lesson, the student should be able to identify major functions of the upper respiratory tract, describe common causes and symptoms of allergic rhinitis, differentiate between H1 and H2 histamine receptors, compare and contrast the oral and intranasal decongestants, discuss the pharmacotherapy of cough, describe the role and expectorants and mucolytics in treating bronchial congestion. The respiratory system is one of the most important organ systems. A mere 5 to 6 minutes without breathing may result in death. When functioning properly, this system provides the body with the oxygen critical for all cells to carry on normal activities. The respiratory system also provides a means by which the body can rid itself of excess acids and bases. This lesson examines drugs used to treat conditions associated with the upper respiratory tract: allergic rhinitis, nasal congestion, and cough. This presents the pharmacotherapy of asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, conditions that affect the lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory system, physiology of the upper respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract consists of the nose, nasal cavity, the pharynx, the paranasal sinuses. These passageways warm, humidify, and clean the air before it enters the lungs. This process is sometimes referred to as the air conditioning function of the respiratory system. The upper respiratory tract also traps particulate matter and many pathogens, preventing them from being carried to bronchioles and alveoli, where they could access the capillaries of the systemic circulation. The mucous membrane of the upper respiratory tract is lined with ciliated epithelium, which traps and sweeps the pathogens and particulate matter posteriorly, where it is swallowed when the person coughs or clears the throat. The nasal mucosa is a dynamic structure richly supplied with vascular tissue that is controlled in part by the autonomic nervous system. Activation of the sympathetic nervous system constricts arterioles in the nose, reducing the thickness of the mucosal layer, and this serves to widen the airway and allow more air to enter. Parasympathetic activation has the opposite effect. Arterioles dilate and more mucus is reduced. This difference is important during therapy with drugs that affect the autonomic nervous system. For example, administration of a sympathomimetic will shrink the nasal mucosa, relieving the nasal stuffiness associated with the common cold. On the other hand, parasympathetic drugs cause increased blood flow to the nose with increased nasal stuffiness and a runny nose as side effect. The nasal mucosa is also part of the first line of body defense. Up to a quart of nasal mucus is produced daily, and this fluid is rich with immunoglobulins that are able to neutralize airborne pathogens. The mucosa also contains various defense cells that can activate, complement, or engulf microbes. Mast cells, which contain histamine, also line the nasal mucosa, and these play a major role in causing the symptoms of allergic rhinitis. The upper respiratory infection or URIs include the common cold, acute rhinitis, sinusitis, and acute pharyngitis. The common cold is the most prevalent type of upper respiratory infection. Adults have an average of 2 to 4 colds per year, and children, they have an average of 4 to 2 or 4 to 12 colds per year. Incidence is seasonally variable. 50% of the population experiences a winter cold and 25% experience a summer cold. A cold is not considered a life-threatening illness, but it does cause physical and mental discomfort and lost time at work and school. The common cold is an expensive illness in the United States, where more than 60 billion is spent each year on over-the-counter cold and cough preparations, in addition to missed time at work and school. Now you have your 3 phases of respiration, namely, number 1, your ventilation. It is the phase in which oxygen passes through the airways. With every inspiration, air is moved into the lungs, and with every expiration, air is transported out of the lungs. Perfusion, on the other hand, involves blood flow at the alveolar capillary bed. Perfusion is influenced by alveolar pressure. Now, for gas exchange to occur, the perfusion of each alveolus must be matched by adequate ventilation. Factors such as mucosal edema, secretions, and bronchospasm increase resistance to airflow and decrease ventilation and diffusion of gases. Diffusion, the movement of molecule from higher to lower concentration, takes place when oxygen passes into the capillary bed to be circulated, and carbon dioxide leaves the capillary bed and diffuses into the alveoli for ventilatory excretion. Now, allergic rhinitis or hay fever is the inflammation of the nasal mucosa due to exposure to allergens, and although not life-threatening, allergic rhinitis is a condition affecting millions of patients, and pharmacotherapy is frequently necessary to control. Now, to control the rhinitis. A cold is most contagious 1 to 4 days before the onset of the symptoms or the incubation period, and during the first 3 days of cold. Transmission occurs more frequently from touching contaminated surfaces and then touching the nose or mouth than it does from contact with viral droplets released by sneezing. The groups of drugs used to manage cold symptoms include antihistamines, decongestants, antitussives, and expectorants. These drugs can be used singly or in combination preparation. Symptoms of the common cold would include rhinorrhea, nasal congestion, cough, and increased mucosal secretions. If a bacterial infection secondary to the cold occurs, infectious rhinitis may result, and nasal discharge becomes tenacious, mucoid, and yellow or green. The nasal secretions are discolored by white blood cells and cellular debris that are byproducts of the fight against the bacterial infection. As with other allergies, the cause of allergic rhinitis is exposure to an antigen. An antigen or allergen may be defined as anything that is recognized as foreign by the body's defense system. The specific allergen responsible for a patient's allergic rhinitis is often difficult to pinpoint. However, the most common agent are pollens from weeds, grasses, and trees, mold spores, dust mites, certain food, and animal dander. Chemical fumes, tobacco smoke, or air pollutants such as ozone are non-allergenic factors that may worsen the symptoms. In addition, there is a strong genetic predisposition to allergic rhinitis. Some patients experience symptoms of allergic rhinitis only at specific times of the year when pollen levels are at high levels in the environment. These periods are typically in the spring and fall when plants and trees are blooming, thus the name seasonal allergic rhinitis. Obviously, the blooming season changes with the geographic location and with each species of plants. Now, this patient may need symptom relief for only a few months during the year. Other patients, however, are afflicted with allergic rhinitis throughout the year because they are continuously exposed to indoor allergens such as dust mites, animal dander, or mold. This variation is called perennial allergic rhinitis. These patients may require continuous pharmacotherapy. Now, it is often not clear whether a person is experiencing seasonal or perennial allergic rhinitis. Patients with seasonal allergic rhinitis or seasonal allergies may also be sensitive to some of the perennial allergens, and it is also common for one allergen to sensitize the patient to another. For example, during ragweed season, a patient may become hyperresponsive to other allergens such as mold spores or animal dander. The body's response and the symptoms of allergic rhinitis are the same, however, regardless of the specific allergens. Allergy testing can help to identify the specific allergens producing the symptoms. Now, the fundamental pathophysiology responsible for allergic rhinitis is inflammation of the mucous membranes in the nose, throat, and airways. The nasal mucosa is rich with mast cells, a type of connective tissue cell, and basophils, a type of leukocyte, which recognize antigens as they enter the body. Patients with allergic rhinitis contain greater number of mast cells, and an immediate hypersensitivity response releases histamine and other inflammatory mediators from the mast cells and basophils, producing sneezing, itchy nasal membranes, and watery eyes. A delayed hypersensitivity reaction also occurs 4 to 8 hours after the initial exposure, causing continuous inflammation of the mucosa and adding to the chronic nasal congestion experienced by these patients. Because histamine is released during an allergic response, many signs and symptoms of allergy are similar to those of inflammation. The therapeutic goal of treating allergic rhinitis are to prevent its occurrence and to relieve symptoms. Thus, drugs used to treat allergic rhinitis may be grouped into two simple categories. Preventers, they are used for prophylaxis and include antihistamines, intranasal corticosteroids, and mast cell stabilizers. Relievers are used to provide immediate, though temporary, relief for acute allergy symptoms once they have occurred. Relievers include the oral and intranasal decongestants, usually drugs from the sympathomimetic class. In addition to treating allergic rhinitis with drugs, nurses should help patients identify sources of the allergies and recommended appropriate interventions. These may include removing pets from the home environment, cleaning moldy surfaces, using microfilters on air conditioning units, and cleaning dust mites out of bedding carpet or couches. For the pathophysiology of your histamine, will have exposure to the different pollens depending on the type of pollens that a person is allergic to. Then, the production of immunoglobulin E antibodies by the plasma cells, wherein the plasma cell would spread it out throughout the body. The immunoglobulin E antibodies will bind to the different mast cells that are present, especially on the patient's nose. Inside the mast cells, you have your histamine and also the binding site of your allergy antibodies found in your mast cells. Now, when your immunoglobulin E has reacted with your or binds with the pollen, the antibodies or immunoglobulin E binds with the pollen, it causes the histamine to be released from the mast cells, wherein the histamine would cause allergy symptoms such as excessive watery colds coming out of the nose of the patient. Pharmacology of allergic rhinitis with H1 receptor antagonist and mast cell stabilizers. Histamine is a chemical mediator of inflammation that is responsible for many of the symptoms of allergic rhinitis. When released from mast cells and basophils, histamine reaches its receptors, which would cause itching, increased mucus secretion, nasal congestion, and sometimes breathing difficulty and problems with their breathing capacity. In more severe allergic states, the histamine release may cause bronchoconstriction, edema, hypotension, and other different symptoms of anaphylaxis, severe cases of allergic reaction. Now, we have two types of your H receptors or histamine receptors. You have your H1, which is responsible for allergic symptoms. The H2 would be responsible for peptic ulcers in the gastric mucosa. On the other hand, antihistamines are drugs that selectively block histamine from reaching its H1 receptors, thus alleviating allergic symptoms. Because of the term antihistamine, it is non-specific and does not indicate which of the two histamine receptors are affected. H1 receptor antagonist is a more accurate name. In clinical practice, as well as in this text, The two terms are used interchangeably. Now, the most frequent therapeutic use of antihistamines is for the treatment of allergies. These medications provide symptomatic relief from the characteristic sneezing, runny nose, and itching of the eyes, nose, and throat of allergic rhinitis. Antihistamines are often combined with decongestants and antitussives in over-the-counter cold and sinus medicines. Common over-the-counter antihistamine combinations used to treat allergies are listed in the incoming tables later. Antihistamines are most effective when taken prophylactically to prevent allergic symptoms. Their effectiveness in reversing allergic symptoms is limited. Their effectiveness may diminish with long-term use, and in addition to producing their antihistamine effects, these drugs cause typical anticholinergic effects. Anticholinergic effects are responsible for certain beneficial effects of the antihistamines, such as drying of mucous membranes, which results in less nasal congestion and tearing. Many H1 receptor antagonists are available as medications. They all have the same basic mechanism of action and are equally effective in treating allergic rhinitis and other mild allergies. Adverse effects are similar but differ in intensity among the various antihistamines. The older first-generation drugs have the potential to cause significant drowsiness, which can be a limiting adverse effect in some patients. After a few doses, tolerance generally develops to this sedative action. The newer second-generation drugs have less tendency to cause sedation. Alcohol and other central nervous system depressants should be used with caution when taking antihistamines because their sedating effects may be additive, even for the second-generation drugs. Some patients' nervousness and tremors, anticholinergic adverse effects are also common in some patients. These include excessive drying of mucous membranes, which can lead to dry mouth and urinary hesitancy, an effect that is troublesome for patients with prostatic hypertrophy. Some antihistamines produce more pronounced anticholinergic effects than others. Diphenhydramine and clemastine produce the greatest incidence of anticholinergic side effects, whereas the second-generation drugs, loratadine, desloratadine, and fexofenadine, they produce the least. Although most antihistamines are given through oral route, azelastine and olopatadine are available by the intranasal route. These medications are as effective as the per-orem antihistamines, but because they are applied locally to the nasal mucosa, limited systemic absorption occurs. Both these drugs are also available as ophthalmic drops for the treatment of allergic conjunctivitis. In addition to allergic rhinitis, antihistamines have been used to treat several other disorders, including the following. Number 1, you have vertigo and motion sickness. Nausea resulting from vertigo or motion sickness responds well to antihistamines. These drugs act by suppressing the vomiting center in the medulla and depressing neurons of the vestibular apparatus of the onset of symptoms. Meclizine and dimenhydrinate are two common antihistamines used for this purpose. Parkinson's disease. Drugs with significant anticholinergic actions are used to treat mild forms of Parkinson's disease. They are also used to treat the tremor and certain other adverse effects of conventional antipsychotic drugs. Because diphenhydramine exhibits greater anticholinergic action, it is sometimes used to treat these conditions. Insomnia. Many patients become drowsy after taking first-generation antihistamines. Over-the-counter sleep aids usually include antihistamines such as diphenhydramine and doxylamine. After a few days, patients will become tolerant to the drowsiness produced by these drugs. Thus, they should be used for 2 weeks or less. Urticaria and other skin rashes. Urticaria or hives is often caused by the release of antihistamine. Thus, the condition responds well to H1 receptor antagonists. Symptomatic treatment may include any of the first or second generation drugs, either using oral drugs or topical creams or lotions. So we can see in here in the chart that I have said a while ago, your first generation drugs, the most common here would be your diphenhydramine and promethazine. They are usually given per orem and given at 50 to 100 milligrams every 4 to 6 hours. But for your diphenhydramine, you have 25 to 50 milligrams 3 to 4 times a day per orem. They have adverse effects of dry mouth, headache, dizziness, urinary retention, thickening of bronchial secretion, nausea, and vomiting sometimes. For your second generation drugs, most common will be your cetirizine, levocetirizine, and loratadine. All of them also given per orem. Now, as compared with your first generation, the second generation drugs could exhibit non-drowsy effects when taken per orem once the drug has started its action. We also have combination of different medications together with your antihistamine, such as the combination of antihistamine, decongestants, and analgesics, wherein different brands such as Benadryl allergy and cold tablets will have diphenhydramine, phenylephrine, and acetaminophen. Tylenol will have diphenhydramine, however, it could only have acetaminophen, which is an analgesic type of medication. The others could have 3 combinations, while others could only have 2 combinations at most. Now, we have your intranasal corticosteroids and miscellaneous drugs. For your intranasal corticosteroids, corticosteroids, also known as glucocorticoids, are applied directly to the nasal mucosa to prevent symptoms of allergic rhinitis. They have largely replaced antihistamines as preferred drugs for the treatment of perennial allergic rhinitis. These drugs are listed in the table. As you can see, you have budesonide, flunisolide, and mometasone as an example. Now, pharmacotherapy of allergic rhinitis with intranasal corticosteroid. Although corticosteroids are very effective, their use as systemic therapy is limited by potentially serious adverse effects. Intranasal corticosteroids, however, produce virtually no serious adverse effects. Because of their effectiveness and safety, the intranasal corticosteroids are often first-line drugs in the treatment of allergic rhinitis. Some of the corticosteroids are also administered by inhaler for the treatment of asthma. When sprayed onto the nasal mucosa, corticosteroids decrease the secretion of inflammatory mediators. They reduce tissue edema and cause a mild vasoconstriction. They are a consistent dose of drug per spray. All have equal effectiveness. Unlike the sympathomimetics, however, intranasal corticosteroids do not have immediate benefits. 1 to 3 weeks may be required to achieve peak response, especially when treating perennial rhinitis. Because of this delayed effect, intranasal corticosteroids are more effective when taken in advance of expected allergen exposure. Now, when corticosteroids are administered correctly, their action is limited to the nasal passages. The most frequently reported adverse effect is an intense burning sensation in the nose that occurs immediately after spraying. Excessive drying of the nasal mucosa may occur, leading to epistaxis. There are several alternatives for patients who do not respond to intranasal corticosteroids. For example, intranasal cromolyn. This is approved as an OTC drug, and this is used for the treatment of allergy and cold symptoms. Because it inhibits the release of it inhibits the release of histamine from mast cells. Cromolyn is called a mast cell stabilizer. Most effective when given prior to allergen exposure, cromolyn has few adverse effects. Other alternatives to the intranasal corticosteroids in treating allergies would include your Montelukast singulaire and your Ipratropium atrovent. Those are the very common types of your miscellaneous drug. Decongestants or decongestants, they are drugs that relieve nasal congestions. They are administered by either the oral or intranasal routes and are often combined with antihistamines in the pharmacotherapy of allergies or the common cold. Now, for the pharmacotherapy of nasal congestion with decongestants, most decongestants are sympathomimetics, drugs that activate the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathomimetics with alpha-adrenergic activity are effective at relieving the nasal congestion associated with the common cold or allergic rhinitis when given by either the oral or intranasal route. The intranasal preparations such as oxymetazoline are available over the counter as sprays or drops, and they produce an effective response within minutes. Intranasal sympathomimetics produce few systemic effects because almost none of the drug is absorbed into the circulation. The most serious limiting side effect of the intranasal preparations is rebound congestion, a condition characterized by hypersecretion of mucus and worsening nasal congestion once the drug effects wear off. This can lead to a cycle of increased drug use as the condition worsens. Because of this rebound congestion, intranasal sympathomimetics should be used for no longer than 3 to 5 days. Patients with allergic rhinitis who develop tolerance to the effects of decongestants should be gradually switched to intranasal corticosteroids because they do not cause rebound congestion. When administered orally, sympathomimetics do not produce rebound congestion. Their onset of action by this route, however, is much slower than when administered intranasally, and they are less effective at relieving severe congestion. The possibility of systemic adverse effect is also greater than the oral drugs. Potential adverse effects include hypertension and central nervous system stimulation that may lead to insomnia and anxiety. Prior to the year 2000, pseudoephedrine was the most common decongestant included in oral over-the-counter cold and allergy medicines. Pseudoephedrine, however, is the starting chemical for the illegal synthesis of methamphetamine by drug traffickers. Although pseudoephedrine is still available over the counter, pharmacists are required to monitor its distribution by keeping a log of patients' names and addresses, checking the photo identification of the buyer, and limiting the quantities of the drug that are sold at one time. It should be noted that these precautions are being taken not because of pseudoephedrine itself is a dangerous drug, but to limit the availability of the drug to illicit makers of methamphetamine. Manufacturers have reformulated their over-the-counter cold medicines to contain phenylephrine rather than pseudoephedrine. Because of the sympathomimetics relief of only nasal congestion, they are often combined with antihistamines to control sneezing and tearing. It is interesting to note that some over-the-counter drugs having the same basic name, such as synephrine, Afrin, and also Vicks, may contain different sympathomimetics. For example, neosynephrine decongestants with 12-hour duration contain the drug oxymetazoline. Neosynephrine preparations that last 46 hours contain phenylephrine. Now, pharmacotherapy with antitussives. Cough is a natural reflex mechanism that serves to forcibly remove excess secretions and foreign materials from the respiratory system. In diseases such as emphysema and bronchitis, or when liquids have been aspirated into the bronchi, it is not desirable to suppress the normal cough reflex. Dry hacking, non-productive cough, however, can be irritating to the membranes of the throat and can deprive a patient of much needed rest. It is these types of conditions in which therapy with medications that control cough, known as antitussives, may be warranted. Antitussives are classified as opioids or non-opioids and are listed in the incoming charts. Opioids, the most effective antitussives, act by raising the cough threshold in the central nervous system. Codeine and hydrocodone are the most frequently used opioids antitussives. Doses need to suppress the cough reflex could be very low. Thus, there is minimal potential for dependence. Most opioid cough mixtures are classified as Schedule 3, 4, or 5 drugs and are reserved for serious cough conditions. Though not common, overdose from opioid cough remedies may cause significant respiratory depression. Care must be taken when using these medications in patients with asthma because bronchoconstriction may occur. Opioids may be combined with other drugs such as antihistamines, decongestants, and non-opioid antitussives in the therapy of severe cold or flu symptoms. Some of these combinations are listed in the incoming charts. Now, the most frequently used non-opioid antitussive is dextromethorphan, which is available in over-the-counter cold and flu medications. Dextromethorphan is chemically similar to the opioids and also acts on the central nervous system to raise the cough threshold. Although it does not have the same level of abuse potential as the opioids, large amounts of dextromethorphan produce symptoms that include hallucinations, slurred speech, dizziness, drowsiness, euphoria, and lack of motor coordination. Nurses should be aware of the potential for abuse of this drug, especially among teens, and should counsel patients to not exceed recommended dosages. Pharmacotherapy with expectorants and mucolytics. Expectorants are drugs that reduce the thickness or viscosity of bronchial secretions, thus increasing mucus flow that can then be removed more easily by coughing. The most effective over-the-counter expectorant is guaifenesin. Like dextromethorphan, guaifenesin produces few adverse effects and is a common ingredient in many over-the-counter multi-symptom cold and flu preparations. It is most effective in treating dry, non-productive cough, but it may also be of benefit for patients with productive cough. Research has questioned the effectiveness of guaifenesin in reducing acute cold symptoms. The dosage range used in cold remedies is usually too low to have much positive benefits for patients. Non-prescription cough and cold products, including those containing guaifenesin, should not be used in children under 6 years of age. Acetylcysteine or mucomyst is one of the few drugs available to directly loosen thick, viscous bronchial secretions. Drugs of this type, which are called mucolytics, break down the chemical structure of mucus molecules. The mucus becomes thinner and can be removed more easily by coughing. Acetylcysteine is delivered by the inhalation route and is not available over the counter. It is used in patients who have cystic fibrosis, chronic bronchitis, or other diseases that produce large amounts of thick bronchial secretions. Mucomist can trigger bronchospasm and has an offensive odor resembling rotten eggs. A second mucolytic, Dornase alpha, is approved for maintenance therapy in the management of thick bronchial secretions. Dornase alpha breaks down DNA molecules in the mucus, causing it to become less viscous. Acetylcysteine is also administered through IV route to patients who have received an overdose of acetaminophen. For the second part of your respiratory tract agents, you'll have drugs for asthma and other pulmonary disorders. So, in this chapter, the student should be able to identify anatomic structures associated with the lower respiratory tract and their functions. Explain how the autonomic nervous system regulates airflow in the lower respiratory tract and how this process can be modified with drugs. Compare the advantages and disadvantages of using the inhalation route of administration for pulmonary drugs. Describe the types of devices used to deliver aerosol therapies through the inhalation route. Compare also and contrast the pharmacotherapy of acute and chronic asthma. Describe the nurse's role in the pharmacologic treatment of lower respiratory tract disorders. Lastly, use the nursing process to care for patients who are receiving pharmacotherapy for lower respiratory tract disorders. The flow of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and other gases into and out of the human body is dynamic and in constant flux. Continuous control of the airways is necessary to bring an abundant supply of essential gases to the pulmonary capillaries and to rid the body of waste products. Any restrictions in this dynamic flow, even for brief periods, may result in serious consequences. This discussion examines drugs used in the pharmacotherapy of two primary pulmonary disorders. You have asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The chest cavity is a closed compartment bound by 12 ribs, the diaphragm, thoracic vertebrae, sternum, neck muscles, and intercostal muscles between the ribs. The pleura are membranes that encase the lungs. The lungs are divided into lobes. The right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has 2 lobes. The heart, which is not attached to the lungs, lies on the mid-left side in the chest cavity. Ventilation is the process of moving air in and out of the lungs. As the diaphragm contracts and lowers in position, it creates a negative pressure that draws air into the lungs and inspiration occurs. During expiration, the diaphragm relaxes and air leaves the lungs passively with no energy expenditure required. Ventilation is a purely mechanical process that occurs approximately 12 to 18 times per minute in adults, a rate determined by neurons in the brainstem. This rate may be modified by a number of factors, including emotions, fever, stress, blood pH, and certain medications. The respiratory tree ends in dilated sacs called alveoli, which have no smooth muscle but are abundantly rich in capillaries. An extremely thin membrane in the alveoli separates the airway from the pulmonary capillaries, allowing gases to readily move between the internal environment of the blood and the inspired air. As oxygen crosses this membrane, it is exchanged for carbon dioxide, a cellular waste product that travels from the blood to the air. The lung is richly supplied with blood, and blood flow through the lungs is called perfusion. Bronchiolar, smooth muscle. We have your bronchioles. They are muscular, elastic structures whose diameter or lumen varies with the contraction or relaxation of smooth muscles. Bronchodilation opens the lumen, allowing air to enter the lungs more freely. So, it increases the supply of oxygen to the body's tissues. Bronchoconstriction closes the lumen, resulting in less airflow. Bronchodilation and bronchoconstriction are largely regulated by the two branches of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic branch activates beta-2 adrenergic receptors, which causes bronchial smooth muscle to relax, the airway diameter to increase, and bronchodilation to occur. The parasympathetic branch causes bronchial smooth muscles to contract, the airway diameter to narrow, and bronchoconstriction to occur. Drugs that enhance bronchodilation will enable the patient to breathe easier. Drugs that stimulate beta-2 adrenergic receptors, commonly called bronchodilators, are some of the most frequently prescribed drugs for treating pulmonary disorders. On the other hand, drugs that cause bronchoconstriction may cause breathing to become labored and the patient to become short of breath. Now, surfactant lowers the surface tension in the alveoli and prevents interstitial fluid from entering. Increased lung compliance is present with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD, and decreased lung compliance occurs with restrictive pulmonary disease. With low compliance, there is decreased lung volume resulting from increased connective tissue or increased surface tension. The lung becomes stiff and it takes greater than normal pressure to expand lung tissue. For your tracheobronchial tube, this is composed of smooth muscles. The fibers spiraling around the tracheobronchial tube. making it more closely spaced. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system affects the bronchial smooth muscles in opposite ways. For your vagus nerve, a part of your parasympathetic nervous system, it releases acetylcholine, which causes bronchoconstriction. The sympathetic nervous system releases epinephrine, which stimulates the beta-2 receptor in the bronchial smooth muscle, resulting in bronchodilation. These two nervous systems counterbalance each other to maintain homeostasis. Now we have your chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or also known as your COPD. COPD and restrictive pulmonary disease are two of the major categories of lower respiratory tract disorders. It has 4 types. You have your chronic bronchitis, bronchiectasis, emphysema, and asthma. Chronic bronchitis, bronchiectasis, and emphysema is a result of irreversible lung tissue damage. The lung tissue changes, which results from an acute asthmatic attack. These are normally reversible on the other hand. However, if the attacks are frequent and asthma becomes chronic, irreversible changes in the lung tissue may result. Patients with COPD usually have a decrease in forced expiration volume in 1 second as measured by pulmonary function test. For your restrictive lung disease, it is a decrease in total lung capacity because of fluid accumulation or the loss of the elasticity of the lungs. So you have pulmonary edema, pulmonary fibrosis, pneumonitis, lung tumor, thoracic deformities, and disorders affecting the thoracic muscular wall, such as myasthenia gravis. Now we start with the pathophysiology of your asthma. Asthma is one of the most common chronic conditions in the United States, affecting 20 million Americans. Although the disorder can affect a person of any age, asthma is often considered a pediatric disease. Characterized by acute bronchospasm, asthma can cause intense breathlessness, coughing, and gasping for air. Along with bronchoconstriction, an acute inflammatory response stimulates histamine secretion, which increases mucus and edema in the airway. As in allergic rhinitis, the airway becomes hyperresponsive to allergens. Both bronchospasms and inflammation contribute to airway obstruction. The patient with asthma can present with acute or chronic symptoms. Intervals between symptoms may vary from days to weeks to months. Some patients experience asthma when exposed to specific triggers, such as those listed in the table. Others experience the disorder on exertion, a condition called exercise-induced asthma. Status asthmaticus is a severe prolonged form of asthma unresponsive to drug treatment that may lead to respiratory failure. Now, because asthma has both a bronchoconstriction component and an inflammation component, pharmacotherapy of the disease focuses on one or both of these mechanisms. The goals of drug therapy are twofold. Number one is to terminate acute bronchospasm in progress, and also, number two, to reduce the frequency of asthma attacks. Now, different medications are needed to achieve each of these goals. Now, we have categories of asthma drugs. We have two simple classes. Number one, you have your quick relief medication. These are short and intermediate acting beta-2 adrenergic agonists, anticholinergic and systemic corticosteroids. Long-acting medications will be your inhaled corticosteroids, mast cell stabilizers, leukotriene modifiers, long-acting beta-2 adrenergic antagonists. Then you have methylxanthine and immunomodulators. Now, for your asthma, the airways become obstructed from either inflammation of the lining of the airways or constriction of the bronchial smooth muscle. A known allergen, for example, which is your pollen, no, is inhaled, causing activation of antibodies that recognize the pollen. Now, mast cells and antihistamines are activated, initiating a local inflammatory response. Prostaglandins enhance the effects of histamine. Leukotrienes also respond, enhancing the inflammatory response. White blood cells responding to the area release of inflammatory mediators. A stimulus causes an inflammatory reaction, increasing the size of the bronchial lining. The results in restriction of the airway. There may be a bronchial smooth muscle reaction at the same time. These are two kinds of, there are two kinds of asthma. First, you have your extrinsic asthma, also known as atopic, caused by allergens such as pollen, animal dander, or the dusts inside the or the dry skin of your pets, mold or dust, often accompanied by allergic rhinitis, eczema, and other infectious agents. Intrinsic asthma, also known as non-atopic, caused by a non-allergenic factor or non-allergic factor such as following a respiratory tract infection, exposure to cold air, changes in air humidity, or respiratory irritants. Now, triggers for the asthmatic patient can also or can often be identified and avoided. Again, I just repeated. Now, patients can learn to check peak flow levels and manage symptoms in conjunction with their caregiver. Well-controlled asthma typically has temporary, reversible exacerbations that can be controlled with medications. often in an outpatient setting, no? With frequent attacks, a mild exposure to a known trigger will often be sufficient to exacerbate an attack. Patients who do not respond to medications or who use medications improperly may die during an asthma attack. Bronchitis or chronic bronchitis, you have increased mucus production caused by infection and airborne irritants that block airways in the lungs, results in the decreased ability to exchange gases. There are two forms of bronchitis: your acute bronchitis, where blockage of the airway is reversible, and chronic bronchitis, where blockage is not reversible. Patients with acute bronchitis are symptomatic, typically for 7 to 10 days, often due to viral but sometimes bacterial infection. Patients with chronic bronchitis will have a symptom of a chronic productive cough for at least 3 consecutive months in 2 consecutive years. There is increased mucus production, inflammatory changes, and ultimately fibrosis in the airway walls. The patient with chronic bronchitis has an increased incidence of respiratory infection. Now, patients with acute bronchitis who have a resolution of symptoms and respiratory status will return to normal condition. Now, chronic bronchitis is classified as a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is often linked to smoking and has a progressive pattern. Shortness of breath is initially present only with exertion, and eventually it is present even at rest. Patients with chronic bronchitis often develop right-sided heart failure and peripheral or dependent edema. Patients will have acute exacerbation of chronic bronchitis. For your bronchiectasis, bronchi and bronchioles become abnormally and permanently dilated, caused by infection and inflammation. This results in excessive production of mucus that obstructs the bronchi. There is some obstruction of the airways and the chronic infections. The changes within the lung can be localized or generalized. The lung may develop areas of atelectasis, where thick mucus obstructs the smaller airways, making the mucus difficult to expel. This results in inflammation and infection of the airways and leads to bronchiectasis. Early prognosis and appropriate treatment of infections are essential for management. Postural drainage and chest physical therapy aid in movement of mucus from the airways. The difficulty in breathing is caused by excessive mucus, similar to patient with COPD. Now, medications frequently prescribed for COPD would include bronchodilators such as your sympathomimetics, your adrenergics, or parasympatholytics, anticholinergic drugs, your ipratropium bromide, and methylxanthines such as caffeine and theophylline. They are used to assist in opening narrowed airways. Glucocorticoids or steroids are used to decrease inflammation. Leukotriene modifiers reduce inflammation in the lung tissue, and cromolyn acts as an anti-inflammatory agent by suppressing the release of histamine and other mediators from the mast cells. Expectorants are used to assist in loosening mucus from the airways. Antibiotics may be prescribed to prevent serious complications from bacterial infection. Now you have your emphysema. Chronic inflammation reduces the flexibility of the walls of alveoli, resulting in overdistension of the alveolar walls. This causes air to be trapped in the lungs, impeding gas exchange. Smoking is often linked to the development of emphysema. A less frequent cause is an inherited alpha antitrypsin deficiency. Symptoms often begin insidiously and are progressive. Shortness of breath is initially associated with exertion, when then it presents during resting. These patients are more susceptible to lung infection, and supplemental oxygen becomes necessary at first for exacerbations, then for daily use. Periodic exacerbations requires hospitalization or requiring hospitalization are not unusual. It is common. Now, cigarette smoking is the most common risk for factors of your chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, especially with chronic bronchitis and emphysema. There is no current known cure for COPD. However, it remains preventable in most cases. Because cigarette smoking is the most directly related cause, not smoking significantly prevents COPD from developing. Quitting smoking will slow the disease process, but not completely stop it. Now, administration of pulmonary drugs through inhalation. The respiratory system offers a rapid and efficient mechanism for delivering drugs. The enormous surface area of the bronchioles and alveoli and the rich blood supply to these areas results in an almost instantaneous onset of action for inhaled substances. Medications are delivered to the respiratory system by aerosol therapy, wherein an aerosol is a suspension of minute liquid droplets or fine solid particles suspended in a gas. The major advantage of aerosol therapy is that it delivers pulmonary drugs to their immediate site of action, thus reducing systemic side effects. To produce an equivalent therapeutic action, an oral drug would have to be given to higher doses and be distributed to all body tissues. Aerosol therapy can give immediate relief for bronchospasms. It is an acute condition during which the bronchular smooth muscle rapidly contracts, leaving the patient gasping for breath. Now, drugs may also be given to loosen viscous mucus in the bronchial tree. It should be clearly understood that drugs delivered by inhalation have the potential to produce systemic effects because there is always some degree of drug absorption across the pulmonary capillaries. For example, anesthetics such as nitrous oxide and isoflurane are delivered through the inhalation route and are rapidly distributed to cause central nervous system depression. Now, solvents such as paint thinners and glues are sometimes intentionally inhaled and can cause serious adverse effects on the nervous system and even death. In general, however, drugs administered by the inhalation route for respiratory conditions produce minimal systemic toxicity. Several devices are used to deliver drugs via the inhalation route. A nebulizer is a small machine that vaporizes a liquid medication into a fine mist that is inhaled using a face mask or handheld device. If the drug is a solid, it may be administered using a dry powder inhaler or DPI. A dry powder inhaler is a small device that is activated by the process of inhalation to deliver a fine powder directly to the bronchial tree. Turbo inhaler and rotahaler are types of DPIs. Now you have metered dose inhaler or MDI. It is a third type of device commonly used to deliver respiratory drugs. MDIs use a propellant to deliver a measured dose of drugs to the lungs during each breath. The patient times the inhalation to the puffs of drug emitted from the MDI. There are disadvantages to administering aerosol therapy. The precise dose received by the patient is difficult to measure because it depends on the patient's breathing pattern and the correct use of the inhaler device. Even under optimal conditions, only 10% to 50% of the drug actually reaches the lower respiratory tract. Patients must be carefully instructed on the correct use of these devices. Swallowing medication that has been deposited in the oral cavity may cause systemic adverse effects if the drug is absorbed in the gastrointestinal tract. In addition, patients should rinse their mouth thoroughly following drug use to reduce the potential for absorption of the drug across the oral mucosa. In treating acute asthma with beta-adrenergic agonists are drugs that activate the sympathetic nervous system, which relaxes bronchial smooth muscle, resulting in bronchodilation. The beta-agonist medication may act either on beta-1 receptors, which are located in the heart, or on beta-2 receptors, which are found in the smooth muscle of the lung, uterus, and other organs. Beta-agonists that activate both beta-1 and beta-2 receptors are called non-selective bronchodilators. Beta-agonists that activate only the beta-2 receptors are called selective drugs. The selective beta-2 adrenergic agonists have largely replaced the older non-selective drugs such as epinephrine and your isoproterenol for asthma pharmacotherapy because they produce fewer cardiac side effects. Beta-agonists are bronchodilators that relax bronchial smooth muscles, thus widening the airway and making breathing easier for the patient. Although quite effective at relieving bronchospasm, beta-agonists have no anti-inflammatory properties. Thus, other drug classes are required to control the inflammatory component of chronic asthma. A practical method for classifying beta-adrenergic agonists for asthma is by their duration of action. Short-acting drugs such as pirbuterol have a rapid onset of action, usually several minutes. Short-acting beta-agonists are the most frequently prescribed drugs for aborting or terminating an acute asthma attack. For this reason, they are sometimes referred to as rescue drugs. Their effects, however, lasts only 2 to 6 hours to the use of short-acting medications and is generally limited to as needed ProRenata or PRN management of acute episodes. Intermediate duration beta agonists have therapeutic effects that last approximately 8 hours, whereas long-acting drugs last up to 12 hours. These medications have a relatively slow onset of action, and in 2005, 2010, and 2015, the Food and Drug Administration issued a black box warning regarding an increase in death among persons taking long-acting beta-2 agonists. Taking an LABA to abort an asthma attack instead of short-acting beta-agonist could result in unrelieved bronchospasm and subsequent death. The LABAs are also delivered via handheld inhalers, and patients may assume they have the same rapid action as the short-acting drugs. Patients must be alerted to the dangers of taking LABAs during an acute episode. Although the risk of asthma-related death is small, LABAs should be used only as adjunctive therapy for patients who cannot be adequately controlled with other medications such as inhaled corticosteroids, or for patients with severe asthma who clearly require two medications for disease management. They are not to be used as monotherapy for this disease. Beta-adrenergic agonists are available in per orem inhaled and parenteral formulation. When taken for respiratory conditions, inhalation is by far the most common route. Inhaled beta-agonists exhibit minimal systemic toxicity because only small amounts of the drugs are absorbed. When given per orem, a longer duration of action is achieved, but systemic adverse effects are more frequently experienced. Systemic effects may include some activation of beta-1 receptors in the heart, which could cause an angina attack or a dysrhythmia in patients with cardiac impairment. With chronic use, tolerance may develop to the bronchodilation effect, and the duration of action will become shorter. Should this occur, the dose of beta-2 agonist may need to be increased, or a second drug may be added to the therapeutic regimen. Increased use of a beta-agonist over a period of hours or days is an indication that the patient's condition is rapidly deteriorating, and medical attention should be sought immediately. For your anticholinergics, anticholinergics block the parasympathetic nervous system. Again, They are anticholinergic blockers. They are alternative bronchodilators for patients who are unable to tolerate the beta-2 adrenergic agonists. Because the parasympathetic response is largely the opposite of the sympathetic response, blocking the parasympathetic nervous system results in actions similar to those of stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. It is predictable then that anticholinergic drugs would cause bronchodilation and have potential application in the pharmacotherapy of asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Although anticholinergics such as atropine have been available for many decades, drugs in this class exhibit many adverse effects when administered by the oral or parenteral routes. However, the discovery of anticholinergics that can be delivered by inhalation led to the approval of two important drugs in this class for asthma. You have your ipratropium and tiotropium. A third drug, aclidinium, was approved in 2012 for the treatment of your chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Ipratropium is the most common anticholinergic drug prescribed for the pharmacotherapy of your COPD and asthma. It has a slower onset of action than most beta agonists and produces a less intense bronchodilation. However, combining ipratropium with a beta agonist produces a greater and more prolonged bronchodilation than using drug separately. Taking advantage of this increased effect, Combivent is a mixture of ipratropium and albuterol in a single MDI canister. Tiotropium has a longer duration of action than your ipratropium and is indicated for the long-term maintenance treatment and prophylaxis of bronchospasm in patients with COPD, including chronic bronchitis and emphysema. The inhaled anticholinergics are relatively safe medications, and the systemic anticholinergic adverse effects are uncommon. Dry mouth, gastrointestinal distress, headache, and anxiety are the most common patient complaints. Now, the complete nursing process applied to patients who are receiving anticholinergics is presented in many ways, especially in resolving patients having acute asthma attacks. Then you have your methylxanthines. The methylxanthines, theophylline and aminophylline, are bronchodilators. They are chemically related to caffeine or caffeine. The methylxanthines are infrequently prescribed because they have narrow safety margin, especially with prolonged use. Adverse effects such as nausea, vomiting, and CNS stimulation occur frequently, and dysrhythmias may be observed at high doses. Like caffeine, methylxanthines can cause nervousness and insomnia. These drugs also have significant interactions with numerous other drugs. Methylxanthines are administered through per orem or intravenous routes rather than by inhalation. Having been largely replaced by safer and more effective drugs, theophylline is currently used primarily for the long-term oral prophylaxis of asthma that is unresponsive to beta agonists or inhaled corticosteroids. Corticosteroids, also known as glucocorticoids, are the most potent natural anti-inflammatory substances known. Because asthma has a major inflammatory component, it should not be surprising that drugs in this class play a major role in the management of this disorder. Corticosteroids dampen the activation of inflammatory cells and increase the production of anti-inflammatory mediators. Mucus production and edema is diminished, thus reducing airway obstruction. Although corticosteroids are not bronchodilators, they synthesize the bronchial smooth muscle to be more responsive to beta agonist stimulation. In addition, they reduce the bronchial hyperresponsiveness to allergens that is responsible for triggering some asthma attacks. In the pharmacotherapy of asthma, corticosteroids may be given systematically or by inhalation. Inhaled corticosteroids are the preferred therapy for preventing asthma attacks. And when inhaled on a daily schedule, corticosteroids suppress inflammation without producing major adverse effects. Although symptoms will improve in the first 1 to 2 weeks of therapy, 4 to 8 weeks may be required for maximum benefit. For patients with persistent asthma, an LABA may be prescribed along with the inhaled corticosteroid to obtain an additive effect. An additive effect. Inhaled corticosteroids must be taken daily to produce their therapeutic effect, and these drugs are not effective at terminating acute asthmatic episodes in progress. Most patients with asthma carry an inhaler containing a rapid-acting beta agonist to terminate acute attacks if they occur. For severe unstable asthma that is unresponsive to other treatment, systemic corticosteroids such as oral prednisone may be prescribed. Treatment time is limited to the shortest length possible, usually 5 to 7 days. And at the end of the brief treatment period, patients are switched to inhaled corticosteroids for long-term management. Inhaled corticosteroids are absorbed into the circulation so slowly that systemic adverse effects are rarely observed. Local side effects include hoarseness and oropharyngeal candidiasis. If taken for longer than 10 days, systemic corticosteroids can produce significant adverse effects including adrenal gland atrophy, peptic ulcers, and hyperglycemia. Growth retardation is a concern with the use of these drugs in children. Leukotrienes are mediators of the immune response that are involved in allergic and asthmatic reactions. Although the prefix leuko implies white blood cells, these inflammatory mediators are synthesized by mast cells as well as neutrophils, basophils, and eosinophils. When released in the airway, leukotrienes promote edema, inflammation, and bronchoconstriction. There are currently 3 drugs that modify leukotriene function. Xileuton acts by blocking lipoxygenase, the enzyme used to synthesize leukotrienes. The remaining 2 drugs in the class, you have zafirlocast and montelukast. They act by blocking leukotriene receptors. All 3 reduce inflammation. They are not considered bronchodilators like the beta-2 agonist, although they do reduce bronchoconstriction indirectly. The leukotriene modifiers are oral medications approved for the prophylaxis of chronic asthma. Xileuton has a more rapid onset of action than the other two leukotriene modifiers, which take as long as 1 week to produce optimum therapeutic benefit. Because of their delayed onset, leukotriene modifiers are ineffective in terminating acute asthma attacks. The current role of leukotriene modifiers in the management of asthma is for persistent asthma that cannot be controlled with inhaled corticosteroids or short-acting beta agonists. Few serious adverse effects are associated with the leukotriene modifiers. Headache, cough, nasal congestion, or gastrointestinal upset may occur. Patients who are older than 65 have been found to experience an increased frequency of infection when taking leukotriene modifiers. These drugs may be contraindicated in patients with significant hepatic dysfunction or in chronic alcohol users because they are extensively metabolized by the liver. Prophylaxis of asthma with mast cell stabilizers. You have cromolyn and nedocromil. They are classified as mast cell stabilizers because their action serves to inhibit mast cells from releasing histamine and other chemical mediators of inflammation. By reducing inflammation, they are able to prevent asthma attacks. Like the corticosteroids, these drugs should be taken on a daily basis because they are not effective for terminating acute attacks. Maximum therapeutic benefit may take several weeks. Both cromolyn and nedocromil are pregnancy category B and exhibit no serious toxicity. The mast cell stabilizers are less effective in preventing chronic asthma than the inhaled corticosteroids. Cromolyn, the first mast stabilizer discovered, is administered by several routes for different indications. Via an MDI or a nebulizer, cromolyn is indicated for asthma prophylaxis. An intranasal form, nasal crom, is used in the treatment of seasonal allergic rhinitis. An ophthalmic solution, Krolom, is used to treat various allergic disorders of the conjunctiva. Gastrocom is a per orem dosage form of cromolyn that is the only FDA-approved drug to treat systemic mastocytosis, a rare condition in which the patient has an excessive number of mast cells. Gastrocom is also used off-label to treat ulcerative colitis and to prevent symptoms associated with food allergies. Adverse effects of the cromolyn include stinging or burning of the nasal mucosa, irritation of the throat, and nasal congestion. Although not common, bronchospasm and anaphylaxis have been reported. Because of its short half-life, cromolyn must be inhaled 4 to 6 times per day. Nedocromil has actions and uses similar to those of cromolyn. Administered with an MDI, the drug produces adverse effects similar to those of cromolyn. Although the longer half-life of nedocromil allows less frequent dosing, patients often experience a bitter, unpleasant taste, which is a common cause for discontinuation of therapy. An ophthalmic form, Allocril, is available to treat allergic conjunctivitis. Additional notes for your respiratory pharmacology. Again, antihistamine, H1 blockers or H1 antagonist competes with histamine for the receptor sites, preventing histamine response. Remember, your H1 constricts the extravascular smooth muscles. H2 increases gastric secretion, talking about the actual histamines. For respiratory agents, your first generation antihistamine causes drowsiness, dry mouth, and other anticholinergic symptoms, such as your diphenhydramine. Second generation antihistamines, these are non-sedative antihistamines with few anticholinergic side effects. These are your cetirizine, loratadine, and azelastine. Then you have your nasal and systemic decongestants, sympathomimetic amines. It stimulates the alpha-adrenergic receptors, producing vascular constriction in the nasal mucosa, such as your ephedrine, phenylephrine, pseudoephedrine, and phenylpropanolamine. For your intranasal glucocorticoids, you have anti-inflammatory action. Your budesonide and dexamethasone are the most common ones. Antitussives, they act on the cough control center in the medulla to suppress cough reflex. This is for non-productive irritating cough, such as your dextromethorphan. For your expectorants, they loosen the bronchial secretion so they can be eliminated by coughing. The best action would still be hydration. For your medication, you have your guaifenesin. Respiratory agents, you have your sympathomimetics, which causes bronchodilation. You have the three, albuterol, metaproterenol, and isoproterenol. For your beta-2 agonist, which causes bronchodilation, your terbutaline and salmeterol. For the dilation of the bronchioles, ipratropium, which is an anticholinergic medication. Methylxanthine derivative, which causes bronchodilation, caffeine, theophylline. Then you have your leukotriene receptor antagonist and synthesis inhibitors. You have your leukotriene, and the following, which are not recommended for acute asthma attack: zafirlukast, Ziluton, and your montelukast. Respiratory agents such as your cromolyn and nedocromil for inhibits histamine release. The other one, anti-inflammatory effect, and also inhibits release of histamine. All of these are coming from your book by Linda E. McQuistion and his or her other co-authors. Pharmacology, a Patient-Centered Nursing Process Approach, 11th edition. That will be the end of your respiratory pharmacology. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice day.